landing my job as a nurse in a real hospital. I worked at a number of different gigs and different facilities in my hometown where I went to college. This includes just about every retirement center, senior living or rehabilitation facility. So, as you concluded, I worked around a lot of old folks. For the situation I was put in, this was just a rung on the ladder. You wanted to work in medicine or even healthcare, plus it was major padding for my resume. I still remember my first night shift in Oakwood Retirement Facility. The nervous energy, the uncertainty, the fear of the unknown. I'd heard stories about night shifts, about how they can mess with your head, your body, and really your entire life. But I needed the job. I was willing to take the risk. And obviously the creepy stories we all hear about night shift workers, the worst of the worst, always seems to happen during these long overnighters. But because of the nature of my job and all the death that I see on a normal basis, I naturally hold beliefs about God, the afterlife, and with that comes beliefs in spirits and entities. You can call it whatever energy you want, but I was afraid of seeing ghosts down the hallway, sounds that shouldn't be there. That kind of thing, it was entirely in my head, but was there nonetheless. As I clocked in, my supervisor Lisa greeted me with this warm smile. Hey, welcome to the night shift. You'll get used to it, I promise. She showed me around, introduced me to the other nurses and other CNAs. They all seemed pretty friendly, welcoming, and experienced. I felt a sense of relief, thinking that I was in good hands. Lisa was really nice and reminded me of my mom, her older sister, just honest, kind, funny, making little jokes and stuff to make me feel comfortable. It was easy to fall right into place on my very first day, and because of that welcoming energy, I had to ask Lisa what was on my mind. So I got a question. I ventured. Sure, what's up? Lisa said. Any stories about this place being haunted? I asked. She gave me a funny look and said, why do you want it to be? I quickly shook my head no. She laughed and said, good. No Indian burial ground, no poltergeist, no ghost in the lounge. This building isn't that old. No one that I know of has ever even reported anything. We all talk, we're close-knit, and it's just not even on our radar. It's such a relief. I've never worked a night shift, and I have all these kind of crazy stuff in my head about what could happen or what I could see. I explained, must really take care of them before they go. Mr. shrugged and said, or maybe there's no such thing as ghosts. Come on, I'll show you where we take our breaks outside. The first few weeks were tough. My body struggled to adjust to that new schedule. I found myself dozing off during my breaks. But as time went on, I started to get the hang of it. I learned how to stay awake, how to stay focused, and how to manage my time efficiently. I even started to enjoy the quiet hours, a peaceful atmosphere, sense of accomplishment that came with making it through another night. 6 months in, I was a pro. I knew every single resident's name, every medication schedule, every cork. I knew how to handle difficult situations. I knew how to calm down agitated residents, and even knew how to make them laugh. I become part of the night shift family, a tight-knit group of people who relied on each other to get through these long hours. But then that's when something changed. At first, it was just a glimpse out of the corner of my eye. This is Jabbar, a sweet but frail resident, was wandering down the hall in her pajamas. I thought nothing of it, assuming she needed to use the bathroom or maybe even get a glass of water. But as the nights continued on, I would see her more frequently, riding silently from room to room. It was as if she was sleepwalking, her eyes open but unfocused. Mentioned to a few of my co-workers, but we all agreed that it was just harmless. Mrs. Jabbar just being her usual nocturnal self. We joke. But as the nights wore on, her wandering became more and more frequent and more pronounced. She darted from room to room. her footsteps light as a ghost. I'd watch her just frozen, and then she'd disappear into the darkness. It started to unnerve me, even though it was subtle and just totally harmless. It's the notion of watching someone who's apparently out of control of their own body. It was strange and very creepy. It had me on edge, but it wasn't anything that ran a chill up my spine. It certainly didn't have me treating Mrs. Jobar any differently. I can't stress just how sweet this little old woman was. Truly one of the nicest people I've ever met, and I took care of many of the other residents in her way. But some of us were worried that perhaps this might be a sign that she would be passing on soon. One night shift, I saw Mrs. Jabbar leave her room briefly, then go back to it. There he is, thinking she was awake this time. I poked my head in to say hello. To my surprise, I was all alone. Her bed was empty and the window latched shut. I even checked the bathroom, but again, no luck. She wasn't in there. I was a little weirded out. I wandered back to the nurse's station to see if maybe I could get an eye on her again. Hey, have you seen Mrs. Hubbard tonight? I asked Rachel during your break. Yeah, I saw her wandering around an hour ago. She replied, her voice low. I don't know what's gotten into her. I shook my head, me neither. But it's kinda starting to freak me out. Rachel leaned in, her eyes very serious. You think it's something more than just sleepwalking? I hesitated because I was unsure. But as I looked down to the darkened hallway, I knew that something was off. Something that would soon escalate into a terror beyond my wildest imagination. I had no way to actually know this or have any confirmation other than just pure intuition. But something had wormed its way into my brain. It was probably that same paranoia that I started the job with, back to pester me about this strange old woman. Well, I started. I saw her leave her room, then go back in real quick. But when I went in to check on her, she was not in there. It was weird. Watched her walk in not a minute before. Rachel's eyes grew wide. The exact same thing happened to me yesterday. She could best. I could tell by the rapidly draining color on her face she wasn't messing with me. I asked her to explain. It was almost identical to my story. This is Joe Barr left her room only to go running back a minute later. Now this was very uncharacteristic of her. So Rachel went to see if she was okay. And again, like me, Mrs. Jovar was nowhere to be found. When Rachel proceeded to look for her, she found her in a different wing on the other side of the building, a distance that would take that old woman 4 or 5 minutes at least to walk. From what she was claiming, it was an impossible happening that she witnessed and been afraid to tell anybody else about it. As we finished our break, that feeling of our knees crept back in. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering back to Jabbar. What was she doing out there in the dark all those times? What was driving her to wander around like a ghost? I figured all manner of things would be keeping her awake. Lost lovers, grown children, deceased family made me sad to think about. But it also made me feel weird too. I knew I had to keep an eye on her to make sure she was safe. As that night wore on, I realized I was in over my head. I wasn't even a nurse, I wasn't even that old. And I wasn't equipped to deal with something that might turn into a very different, potentially even dangerous situation. Still, I convinced myself this was the experience I needed, so I just stuck with it. Everything was pretty normal for the next couple of days, except for those strange late-night wanderings. But other than that, it was chill. It was the start of the next week that things took a weird turn. When I arrived to work, my supervisor Lisa was waiting outside of the door. Immediately, I knew something was up. Myself and another overnight worker, and our named Sarah, arrived at the same time and got the rundown. Alright, listen up, guys, Lisa said. her voice low and serious. We've got a serious situation with Mrs. Jabbar. She's been acting stranger than normal, and we really need to keep an eye on her. I exchanged a word glance with Sarah. What's going on? I asked. Residents have been complaining that she's whispering creepy things to them at night, Lisa explained. Need to make sure she does not wander off anymore. If she gets up, bring her back to her room immediately. I can't get another wave of complaints, especially like I did this morning. Sarah and I nodded, minds racing with worst-case scenarios. We clocked in and began our shift, our senses on high alert. As that night wore on, everything seemed fine and normal. Residents were all quiet, the halls were empty. The only sound I heard was the hum from the vending machines. I was starting to relax, thinking that maybe Lisa had overreacted. We continued on with our nightly duties, make sure to check in on each other and Mrs. Jabbar just in case. And I pressed on without incident, and soon I forgot there'd been an issue at all. Then at exactly 3 a.m. on the dot, I saw Mrs. Jabbar peek out of her room, her eyes fixed on me with this unblinking stare. I did have a chill running down my spine, but I didn't look up, I didn't dare to. I was frozen in terror. My heart was now pounding in my chest. This was definitely new. She never checked to make sure the coast was clear. She was always just walking around in silence. Her picking out like that told me that maybe she was awake, taking care to make sure nobody was watching her. I don't know why, but I remember being absolutely scared to death as she looked at me. Before I could even react though, she just took off down the hall, her tiny feet pattering against the floor. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself down, but my legs just felt like jelly. I knew I had to go after her, and I was scared. Literally scared of the unknown. Her movement seemed faster than normal, and I found myself wondering if she was having some kind of bout of psychosis. Would she attack me? Would she attack another patient? Starting to spiral. I forced myself to stand up, and my eyes scanned the empty hallway. I called out for Sarah, but there was no answer. I was alone without any other option. I did a quick scan of what camera monitors we had access to and saw nothing. Then I decided to go find her. Lisa was very clear that this patient needed to be kept in a room or be all of our asses. I made my way down the hall, my heart racing with every step, and I mean this literally. I couldn't find Mrs. Jabbar anywhere. I searched every room, every corner, but she was just gone. I even went into other wings, the custodial closets, the lounge, the mess hall. This woman did not exist. I was just about ready to pop open the door and start checking the common ground outside the garden or maybe even the parking lot, because she could not be inside this building. Finally, I returned to her room, my breath coming in these short gasps. That's where I found her sitting on the edge of her bed, her head twitching like a puppet on a string. I couldn't believe she was right here the whole time, because again, there's no way she could have snuck around. Me was that high alert. I was tearing up and down those hallways. There's no way she could have gone by me. Still, I watched her head make that odd move. Didn't know what to say. Mrs. Jabbar, do you need help? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her head snapped around, her eyes locking into mine with this unnatural movement. Margaret isn't here anymore, she declared, her voice low and menacing. And she rolled back to face the window, went right back to twitching and making these creepy, clicking sounds. This is all out of my worst nightmare. I bolted out of the room, my heart racing with fear. I found Sarah and dragged her back to Miss Jabbar's room, my words tumbling out in this panic rush, trying to explain everything that I just saw to her. She did her absolute best to calm me down. Nothing really mattered, except for getting her to Joe Barr's room. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the scene. So what, she asked? Not a single thing was now out of place. And when we looked at Mrs. Jabbar, she was sleeping peacefully, her face serene and calm. It was as if nothing just happened at all. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She was so tucked in, it looked like she'd never even gotten out of bed, like I hallucinated the whole thing. Sarah was very cautious about what I was talking about, but when we went and found Rachel, I had her confirm everything that I was saying, so we were all on the same page. We all stuck together for the rest of that shift, our eyes scanning the halls for any sign of movement, but everything was quiet, unwavering silence. Still, we made sure to keep close to one another, just in case anything more had happened. One of us was always watching the doorway to Mrs. Joe Barr's room. When the morning crew arrived, we did our final checks, and when we checked our Mrs. Jabbar, she was dead. Her body was cold and stiff inside of her bed, had that same sweet smile on her face, the one she'd worn all night after her first jump through the halls. We've been checking on her all night long, so we knew that she was alive. I'd seen her roll around a bit. The sun came up though. She silently slipped off. We never knew until ship change. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, mixed with a healthy dose of beer. It was a very creepy couple of nights, and every single one of us had experienced some form of weirdness. Something strange had happened, something that I can't explain. Just glad it's all over. I'm a long-time Colorado resident. About 15 years ago, I moved to a small outlier of a town called Grand Junction. Some of you will know it, but I suspect many have never heard the name. It's quite mostly a blow-through town, and one that services the southwestern corner of the state. I fell in love with the place and called it my forever home. I worked at a mom and pop shop downtown in Grand Junction, where everybody knows everybody. Like any rural community, we have our seasons and the rest of the year is a little quiet. It's the hustle and bustle of the locals, but they're on the trains blowing through town. Time seems to slow down here a little bit if you let it. Almost like a place for a fairy tale. It's one of the reasons it was so easy for me to fall right into the place. Among the familiar faces, one stood out. Warren Barnes, the reading man. For as long as I can remember, Warren was a fixture in our community. His kindness, work ethic, and love for books made him a beloved figure. I'm not sure exactly how long you've been living in Grand Junction, but I've known Warren for as long as I can remember. It seemed like everyone on the block knew his name, knew his schedule, and everyone was very kind to him. Frankly, never seen a homeless man generate such respect. But after having a few conversations with him, I quickly understood why. He was genuinely a sweet old man. It was like talking to your grandpa or something. He was always in a good mood, was kind and always helpful. If he hadn't met such a grisly fate, may have thought he was an angel. Warren's daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. It started at the coffee shop, then visit the library, and finally settled into his favorite alley behind the bridal shop, surrounded by his precious paperbacks. Westerns were his passion, but he devoured everything from history to thriller to philosophy. His knowledge was just staggering. Conversations could easily last hours. As shopkeepers, we relied on Warren for odd jobs, moving boxes and loading trucks, running errands. Always said yes without expecting anything in return. His Army veteran background and travels and seasoned him, but his heart was what made him really special. Grand Junction had adopted him. He became our very own. Warren's relationship with the community was genuine and strong. It's Mary, the baker who saved him fresh bread and pastries. Jake, the hardware store owner, who hired him for handyman work. Rachel, the librarian, who always set aside new releases just for him. We all looked out for Warren, and he repaid us with this kindness and dedication. On one Sunday back in 2021, Warren didn't appear by the late morning. All the shopkeepers and laborers on our street knew something was wrong, we just didn't know how bad. We all waited at first, but by midday, some of the other people that knew weren't a little better than I put in a call to the police department. It's hard to track a guy down that doesn't have a house, and obviously police need more suspicion before they put up missing persons reports or a homeless man. Either way, we didn't like what we heard. The gal that owned the bridal shop just across the street said that someone had found Warren's wallet out by the boat ramp over by the... This was pretty far away from usual places Warren liked to hang out. As I mentioned, he kept a pretty rigid schedule. Biel actually left that day to go meet investigators over by the river to help them out and help get a better idea of what might have happened to him. By then, though, it's far too late. None of us knew just how bad the situation really was. At least not until Warren's body parts started washing up along the river. Arms, legs, chunks of his torso just casually floating along. Beaching under the bridge overpass on the edge of town, in the bow dock, at same place that they found his wallet. We're all in shock, and I mean absolutely blindsided. You have to understand, this wasn't just a hobo. This was someone I said good morning to every day for 10 years. Every single day, this man would sweep the steps in front of my shop or bring me flowers that he found growing in the alley. A truly kind, considerate individual. And someone took the knife to cut them into pieces. Someone targeted them, I could feel it in my soul. How else could this be false? Such a distinguished member of our community. As that now reflect on one's life, I realize just how much he enriched our community. His love for books and learning inspired us. His willingness to help others without expectation of reward reminded us of the importance of kindness. His presence was always there like a steady heartbeat. It made us feel safer and more connected. But as with all good things, Warren's life was not without its challenges. His homelessness was a constant struggle. We did our best to help support him. We'd offer him a place to stay temporarily, or help him find resources. Warren would never complain, never ask for more than he needed. He was content with a simple life, surrounded by books and friends. I honestly can't say that he was actually homeless, because he called Grand Junction home, and we took him as he was. As the sun sets on Grand Junction, I remember Warren's smile. His laughter has infectious enthusiasm. He didn't deserve to meet the fate that he did, and it brings me some weird, distant satisfaction knowing the killer was caught. If justice hadn't been served, I probably would have never slept again. My friend, my neighbor, gutted and dismembered in the dead of night, with no one around to help him. Wish his last moments hadn't been so scary. For now, let's cherish the memories of Warren Barnes, the reading man who brought so much joy and light to our lives. This story is over, but for today, let's honor his spirit, his kindness, and his love for life. Warren, we miss you every day. Live in Grand Junction for a long time, and the crime that happened a couple of winters ago was one for the ages. Not a lot of stuff goes on here. I'll admit the rate of crime in our city is a little higher than the rest of the state, but that's only because we're in a corridor community for neighboring states. Lots of drug trafficking throughout here, some robbery, breaking and entering, but not a lot of outright murder. That stuff sticks with us for a long time, usually till the next one happens. I myself am an old man living alone on a quiet street. The coal house was just another familiar facade, but the son Brian is a different story. I notice strange behavior from him. Sometimes I go outside and find him in his side yard, just staring off in his face. It's weird. First time I saw it, I called his name to say hello. He didn't respond at all. He didn't look vacant or out of it, just deep in thought about something. I chalked it up to just an introverted young man, but over the next year or two, I catch him doing that pretty often, but never when anyone was around. This was something he'd do when he was all alone. Next came the animal abuse. I really only saw this happen once, but still, the kid with her dogs and cats in the community. Don't know if he was killing them, but again, when he thought no one was looking, he'd give them a fist or a boot, throw rocks at them they were too far away. A couple of times, I go outside like I was taking out the trash, just to holler at him to knock it off or go home. He waved at me, act totally normal, like he wasn't just hitting a stranger's dog with a closed fist. Impressed about it, he said he was having a bad day and didn't want the dog to attack him, said it bit him a few times in the past. Knew something was off, but I didn't really know what to do. Wasn't related to him, I didn't want to meddle. The other thing it turned out was that Brian was actually a pretty smart kid, or as weird and quirky as he was. He had his family and even some of the teachers at school pretty wrapped around his finger. Could lie like the best of them and would totally throw questioning adults off his trail. I believe the boy was autistic, or maybe just claimed to be, and one that Brian was keen to take advantage of. It almost made him charming in this weird, creepy way. It casually mentioned how many pints of blood the human body contained, as if we were talking about the weather. He could talk himself out of almost any consequence, or even just basic chores. I'd watch him do it all the time with his parents, with adults in the neighborhood. Brian would look you dead in the eye and tell you the most logical line of shit that you ever heard, and you believe it, because how could a special education boy be that kind? Well, it turned out he was highly intelligent and very manipulative. One look at his mother's testimony will tell you all you need to know. Rumors started circulating around town. Other neighbors told me about Brian's disciplinary issues and school bullying, even physical harm to his peers. I felt the sense of culpability, having witnessed his erratic behavior and not reporting it. Still, it's hard to inject yourself in the business of somebody else's kids. I remember hearing a story from someone on our street who also has kids went to school with Brian. The kid was very mean-spirited. He'd hear about a student in his class prone to having panic attacks, so he'd do everything in his power to make them have one. He would construct these model weapons out of his stuff he found at school, then use them to attack special needs students when no one was looking. Behind the school buildings, making hallways, or even on the bus. It was some of the most heinous stuff I've ever heard. Outright abuse of people Brian deemed lesser than himself. One day, though, there was a couple of boys following Brian home from school. All three of them were walking, but I could tell Brian was trying to get away from these kids. I could see playing this day they weren't friends of his. Brian made it back to his house, rushed inside and slammed the door behind him. The boys threw rocks at the door and called out, "Hey Dahmer, come out Dahmer, we just want to play you fucking freak." When I asked the other neighbors about this, she confirmed it. Brian was known for getting picked on at school, so it was all a little give and take. It definitely felt weird for keeping tabs. This has all felt like pretty average high school antics. Hell, even when I was a boy, kids were goddamn mean to each other. It's always been the case. So I backed off, I quit observing. just figured kids needed to be kids. Then the police started showing up at Cody's house. At first, it was for a single vehicle incident at the boat ramp. In the middle of the night, I saw Brian's parents driving off, returning later with their son. This was very late at night or early in the morning, I don't remember which. I just recall the engine roar and headlights cutting through my front windows, which woke me. Then by the time I moved myself into the living room, they were coming back, Ryan and his parents. The police visits continued. I sensed something was amiss. I mean, what other evidence does a person need? The final nail came, so to speak, when a rumor started downtown about a homeless man that apparently went missing overnight. This was a person I didn't know personally, but he apparently kept a rigid schedule downtown, wherein he would assist different stores with different jobs. But I didn't show everyone knew something was up and called the cops immediately. I didn't think anything about this at first, so I didn't have a reason to connect the two. I remember hearing strange noises from the Coy residence one day, muffled sobs or screams within an hour. The police arrived. Brian was taken away. They briefly questioned him right there in the driveway. I could see him from my own living room standing rigid, upright like he usually did, slowly going through the motions of discussion, but it looked forced, like he was uncomfortable maybe. It's hard to say. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. The story coming out was that a wallet was found down by the boat ramp, Warren Barnes' wallet. That was when I put two and two together, that Brian's car had been retrieved from the river by the police and a local tow company. That couldn't be a coincidence, right? Well, I learned later on the news that sobbing scream that I heard across the street was actually Brian's mother, discovering a very gruesome scene. The back of Brian's closet, he found a plastic bin, the double-wrapped plastic bag beside it. Contents being one rotting human head, a pair of severed hands. Brian was a murderer living just down the road from me. All that strange behavior that I witnessed, dismissed for so long, finally accumulated into the worst nightmare we could have ever imagined. Weird interactions, the bizarre comments. Brian had been thinking about violence for a long time. Perhaps as long as I knew him as a neighbor, I could have been his next victim, an old man alone and helpless. Realized that I narrowly escaped a terrible fate. By the end of that week, I read that most of Barnes was discovered along the river bank, some of him left under a bridge where he'd been sleeping. It seemed that Brian put a lot of thought into his actions, but when it came to actually covering his tracks, it was sloppy and just relied on his ability to lie. And God, that didn't work out for him. I hope I never see him again. I personally didn't know Warren Barnes, but I can imagine the kind of man that he was. His fate was cruel, murdered while sleeping under a bridge, dismembered, left like trash. The thought sent shivers down my spine, and I hope the man finds peace on the other side, as I imagine his last night was not something he'd want to remember. I heard from the locals that they just kept asking, "Brian, why? Why are you doing this? Why?" Frankly, makes my skin crawl. I felt it makes a relief in horror, knowing I no longer live next to a killer. But the memory of Brian's strange behavior, his cryptic comments, and the gruesome fate of Warren Barnes will continue to harm me, left wondering how many other secrets lay hidden behind those closed doors, how many other monsters live among us waiting to strike. Very grateful to his parents, made no effort to conceal anything or muddy the waters. Too often, when family gets involved in diabolical matters such as these, they do everything they can to make sure justice isn't served. Terry wasted no time calling the police and turning Brian in literally within minutes. Our loyalty to the community and personal moral compass led her to the right decision, I believe. The darkness that lurked in Brian's eyes, the evil that consumed him, is a reminder that true horror exists in our world. And I'm left to ponder but other terrors look around here which school great boy or girl will grow up to be the next killer. It's a terrifying thought, but one I entertain, because it's the world we made and the one we currently live in. I've been a law enforcement officer for a few years now, and nothing too crazy is come across my desk or on my radio. Live in a small web of townships, with Grand Junction at the heart of it. As you can imagine, not a whole lot goes on in the backcountry of Colorado. Just about the worst call that I've ever gotten was a man who stepped out on the shoulder of a highway, was struck and killed by a semi with a trailer moving around 80 miles per hour. We pulled up on the scene and it was one of the most awful visuals of my life, one that's kept me awake for a few weeks. That was until Brian Coe Jr. decided he wanted to murder somebody who wasn't involved in every aspect of the case. But I can't confirm what did or didn't happen, or my department. This was the case that rocked our community to its very core. It had every single resident on high alert for at least a week or so. Some folks still haven't recovered fully from that brutal nature of the crime. It happened. Brian Coe is a bit of an anomaly. It's a short list of diagnosed mental disorders, such as clinical depression, ADHD, and autism. That goes back well into his academic history. He wasn't a special needs kid. He's actually a very intelligent kid. But he had certain triggers and behaviors that most folks wouldn't consider normal. I guess I should start this story at the beginning and work all the way up to the case, at least in regard to the suspect and the crime. The earliest signs of trouble were a series of suspicions that Brian had received from school. It seemed that leading up to the murder, Brian had this habit of creating makeshift weapons, usually out of pencils and rulers or other hard-edged stuff, and then would use them to hurt and torture kids. They couldn't defend themselves. I specifically remember a report where Brian and his friend had made some kind of leveraged weapon, like a mace or nunchuck, something like that, then used them to beat the hell out of the special needs student. After he was busted and suspended from school, his parents found a number of similar weapons made inside his room, allegedly. They told Brian that if he didn't dispose of everything and throw it immediately in the dumpster, they call the police and make a problem out of all of it. From what we understand, Brian complied, but everything inside that dumpster, which seemed to satisfy his parents, the teachers at school from here, we would gather that Brian was a very smooth talker. Both the faculty and his parents confirmed it. It seemed like no matter what the discipline was, no matter what the consequence was, Brian would find a way to adapt and even worm his way out of it occasionally. Again, he was freaky smart in that aspect and was usually a step ahead of all the adults in his life. Except he wasn't the reality. As far as I'm concerned, was playing his day for all to see. The physical torment and abuse of other students aside, Brian had a habit of talking about violent, inappropriate subject matter all the time. He'd go on at length about how to cut an artery, how to dismember a corpse or drain blood, or even the best method to pass a polygraph test. And then he would just sit and smile, maybe even laugh, and then say something like, "Sorry, that's a little morbid, isn't it?" Brian was constantly showing signs of being in his physical behavior, but his point of conversation was all the confirmation a person should really need. This kid had seriously twisted thoughts. He wasn't afraid to share with whoever might be around. Huge red flags, at least for me, but not apparent, so it's not really my place to say. Either way, this was turning into a case for alarm. The reality was this: we would later learn from various confessions that Brian would make. Brian had already decided he was gonna kill somebody. His reasoning was he just wanted to see what it felt like to take a human life, and said this without any emotion attached. If anything, maybe even a touch of a grin. This kid was totally detached from reality. The details only get worse from here. So for 6 months he spent all his time planning, prepping, searching for a proper victim or his confession. He said he wanted to kill a homeless person or a prostitute, as he convinced himself either of them turning up missing or dead would call for much less searching and investigating, if reported at all. For what it was, I guess it was a decent plan, but Brian didn't have the know-how to pull off what he would consider a perfect murder. One night, Brian spotted a victim sleeping in a makeshift fort beneath the bridge. A small little flap of nothing just to keep the wind and chill off. The bridge was near a river, and the river led to a boat ramp. I'm sure you can see the little trail of breadcrumbs. This is more of the confession per Brian's story. He parked his car and went to his murder kit. He selected a large kitchen knife and pairs of gloves, as he claimed. A single pair wasn't enough for the amount of gore that a body produced. He snuck up on Barnes, who was asleep, and sank the knife into his neck, which immediately woke Barnes up and prompted him to begin pleading with Brian. The boy didn't care and just continued to stab Barnes' neck with the blade until the man stopped moving. From there, Brian brought his car over, popped the trunk, and dismembered the old man piece by bloody piece, with nothing more than the kitchen knife. Grisly, violent work for a teenager, but he got it done and up to his quote-unquote standards. His next move would be his undoing, as he didn't take enough care to make it work. Brian put the majority of Warren's body in the trunk car, drove over to the boat ramp, and let it roll into the river. We think the trunk was initially open, so Warren's dismembered body floated out and then down the river, and then filled the gory trunk with water to rinse it out. The problem was, the trunk got closed because of rushing water, and a significant amount of blood got trapped within. When we called the tow truck to have the car pulled out of the river, we could actually see thick streaks of crimson running out of the rear compartments. We called Terry Cole, Brian's mother, because at this point we had no reason for suspicion. We actually thought that Brian might have been hurt with a cut he didn't know about, as his story was that he accidentally drove the car in the river, mistake thinking he'd be able to get it back out. It wasn't until an officer found Warren's wallet out there in that same area, then everything started to come together very rapidly. I might add, a car stuck in the boat ramp is weird, but when you couple this kid in the middle of the night, and then missing person report the next morning, we knew where to look. We didn't even have to pay a visit though. Terry called us very soon after that, claiming she made a wild discovery. While cleaning Brian's room, which had an awful smell, she came across a large plastic container, as well as a double-wrapped plastic bag. Thinking it was an old lunch or something like that, she casually just opened it up. Inside she found a blanket of writhing maggots, and beneath that a pair of eyes looking back up at her. She was holding Warren Barnes' head in her hands, stored in a large Tupperware container. The bag held Warren's hands, and for some reason it seemed like Brian thought the corpse would be much harder to identify without a face, teeth, or fingerprints to match. Records of any kind is a smart and twisted plan. That might have worked if he'd chosen a different victim, and maybe hadn't kept the head and hands as souvenirs in his closet. Here are some various quotes made by the suspect, his mother, and officers involved with the investigation. Terry made this statement during questioning. I was tidying up his room, putting things away, and came across a plastic container in his closet. As I started digging through, I found a plastic bag. Curious, I picked it up. Feeling its weight, noticed it was infested with maggots. I took it to the sink, noticed it was double bagged. I opened up the first bag, but couldn't bring myself to open up the second. Immediately I called his father and said, "You need to come over right now." Later, when the officers arrive at the Goatee residence, they ask Brian, Parents have raised concerns about some items they may have found in your room. Can you elaborate? Brian went on to say, yes, I believe so. A human head enhanced from the man that went missing. I killed him with a knife. I always wondered what it would feel like to commit murder. He went on a link about what he did and why he did it. It was the night of February 27th. It was a full moon and I figured I could see so well, so why not try it out? I was in a bad state of mind at the time. I have a major depressive disorder. I was driving around and I saw a shape and I was like, interesting. I'm like, that's a homeless person. So I grabbed my knife, I put on 3 layers of gloves. Because plastic gloves can betray their users because they're so thin. I took the knife, pulled back the canvas, and stabbed his neck. At first he was in a state of panic asking, what are you doing, why? But I just continued stabbing his neck. Or giving us the rundown, Brian seemed eager, almost excited to be recounting such gruesome details, even chuckling between descriptions to this day. Responding officers, investigators, such none of us have ever seen anything like this. And I hope we never do again. His defense after the fact was insanity, but he'd already fucked that up for himself. Can't premeditate a murder for 6 months. Think about how to avoid every consequence, and then just pretend you were crazy after that. He confessed far too much, leaned into his ability to explain things away too much, dug a hole he couldn't get himself out of. The other nail in the coffin were the murder kits. Brian had an unbelievable amount of knowledge on how to kill and dispose of a person, and kept little bundles of supplies in his room and in his car. It showed clear intent that the court was not leaning on. Brian co-received a life sentence, the murder of Warren Barnes, guilty of first-degree murder and tampering with the body. Boy, I've got a night shift story for you. Buckle up, boosters, this one is fucking crazy. I worked a graveyard shift for several different water treatment facilities within the county that I reside. There honestly aren't a lot of us that are certified to operate these facilities. So sometimes multiple outliers can become just one person or one team's responsibility. This was the case for us. So I worked graveyard shift for 2 different facilities. This night in particular, I was working the plant that was well outside of town, merged along a major highway that connected the cities at each end. As it goes, each city was probably 60 miles in either direction. This location was very rural and was often confused for a prison because of its middle of nowhere location. The water treatment plant loomed before like a monolith, its steel and concrete walls gleaming in the moonlight. I trudged the darkness, my boots crunching on the gravel path, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Barbed wire fence seemed to close in around me, prison of my own making. And honestly, they really did have these prison vibes. Lots of big spotlights aimed down at the perimeter, the main building with big access doors on every side. That fully encompassing barbed wire fence was the icing on the cake, though. It made the place look truly unapproachable, and also contributed to the mess that I found myself that night. You see, when I arrive at my job, I have to unlock the chain that keeps the gate shut, then lock it again behind me after I drive in. No one can come on the property without a key, so I had a habit of letting my guard down. That night and many nights before it, I rolled into the water treatment plant, made no effort to lock a single door behind me. Sometimes the work requires me to go in and out of the building, sometimes a lot depending on the readings. And that kind of work needs to be done, so it's just easier to leave the access doors open. Again, we have a 10-foot barbed wire fence running the perimeter lights and cameras all over. And even then, it's a water plant. There's nothing here to steal. No vault of cash, no bricks of gold. Locking doors never even crossed my mind, frankly. I was the sole guardian of this place, the graveyard shift my solitary domain. The tasks were routine, but the isolation was suffocating. I felt like a sentinel, then watch over fortress of water, waiting for the dawn to come. I didn't try to spook myself, necessary stuff, but in hindsight, I almost wish I had. If I'd been a little bit more on my toes, I might have been able to prevent this from ever happening to me. The hours dragged on, each minute ticking by like a countdown to my own doom. My senses grew dull, and my eyes scanning the shadows for movement, my ears straining to hear the slightest sound. Nothing, nada. The night was mine. The water levels and gauges were all good, so it was the golden hour. I whipped out my Nintendo DS and started logging some screen time on whatever video game had my attention. Back then, honestly, I have no idea how long I played, at least an hour, cause I remember glancing up the clock, then being surprised. Get on the ground was the next thing I heard. My heart froze, my muscles locked in terror. Immediately I complied, my eyes fixed on the figure emerging out from the darkness. He was a specter, a ghostly apparition in tattered clothes, his eyes wild and desperate. I couldn't believe this was happening, but he continued to usher me to the ground. To speed me up, he pulled the gun out from behind his back with the dark metal flash under that fluorescent lighting. This was real, I don't know why and I don't know how, but I'm being robbed. I laid my face down and he came over, checked my pockets, and told me to keep my nose to the floor. He had a very deep booming voice, and the weight of his steps on that metal catwalk told me this guy had me by at least 60 pounds. It's big, so how the hell did he sneak in without me even knowing? Sorry, I'm sorry, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I didn't want to do this weird. Almost sounded remorseful. For some reason that put me at ease, albeit only slightly. Didn't sound angry or agitated, just out of options, truly desperate for whatever he thought I had in here at the water plant. He bound my wrists and ankles with duct tape, his hands shaking like leaves the whole time I lay there helpless. He rummaged through my belongings, his eyes gleaming with this mixture of fear and greed, pure desperation. He was carelessly rooting through everything that I had. It was clear he didn't even know what he was looking for. Please, I whispered, my voice barely audible, don't hurt me. Didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the gun in his hand. Watched it transfixed as he waved it around, his finger trembling on the trigger. The barrel itself wasn't trained on anything in particular. Sometimes the wall, sometimes my head. Searching every drawer, every bag, anything inside until he snatched it up, and I heard that familiar jingle, his car keys specifically. Looked over, and he was holding out my lanyard in his hand. This goddamn first place trophy, like a scene out of some kind of movie. It started to come together in his disheveled appearance. The targeting of somewhere remote. This guy needed to get the hell out of town with the quickness. Hell, the guy wasn't even wearing shoes. I just noticed as I laid on the floor and waited to see if he was about to execute me. Then suddenly, as it begun, it was over. He apologized a few more times, saying he never wanted to do this to anyone and hoped I'd be able to forgive him. Little did you know, I've been working on that duct tape around my wrist, damn close to getting my hands free. He couldn't see this. As I kind of rolled over to my side, I told him just go, I'd be fine. He drove off into the night, leaving me alone and helpless. I lay there with my mind racing until I finally managed to free myself. As I did so, I could hear the engine roll off to the gate and then idle for 10 minutes or so. He had gone through all the keys to find the right to get him off the property. Sat there and just waited, just in case he got cold feet and came or something. No. Next thing I heard was the clap of the truck door, the guy peeling off the property, and then especially over the pounding of my heart. I let them know who I was and what had just taken place. The dispatcher was sterile, but told me that officers were en route, not to panic, and there would be someone there soon. Other than that, not a word. This was off-putting, as I was really hoping for some advice, or at least a little sympathy. The police swarmed the facility. Their siren and lights were a welcome respite from the darkness. Fortunately, the hand didn't bother to close the gate behind them, so they rolled right onto the property. I waved them in through the access door and showed them where everything had just gone down. The room was torn apart. The guy's relentless serves through everything. Papers, my personal property, all this kind of string about. The duct tape lay in a pile, spot that I'd been subdued. I even pulled up the camera footage of entering through the door just before 3 a.m. They checked me for wounds and then took my statement. They were very thorough and took care to search everything in the facility, high and low, as not to miss anything that might lead to an arrest. They thought it was just as weird as I did to come rob a water treatment facility in the middle of the night, no less. They nodded their heads when I told him he took the truck, but get away of some kind with a random vehicle. I guess kind of made sense, but even then, where the hell did he come from? It's not like he left his own vehicle behind, not even a bicycle. A few officers hung out there with me until my relief came, at which point I was dismissed. Managers were notified. They gave me a couple of days. Lots of corporate stuff, very boring. I didn't get in trouble, and I got a little time off out of it. They caught that guy later that same day. It turned out that he escaped from inmate custody in the next city over before getting booked. I don't really know the whole story of where he came from or why he was originally arrested. But like I mentioned earlier, the next city was like 55 miles away. This guy must have been walking for days and days through the wilderness along the highway, just hoping for something to come along. Turn up that water facility would have been a beacon in the night for an escaped convict. Bright lights, a big humming building with electricity. Water trucks parked all over. Maybe even a change of clothes and a locker or something. It would have been everything that guy was praying for. And my stupid ass didn't lock the doors. This guy only took a minute or so to get over the barbed wire fence. But after he did, he literally breathed right in. Held me up like it was nothing. Fortunately for me, he was feeling generous in the moment. Didn't kill me or beat me with anything, just put the gun to my face. That's another thing. One of the officers couldn't figure out where you got the gun. Whatever the case, you chose not to use it, and for that at least I am thankful. As I returned to work, the memories lingered, a constant reminder of the terror that I faced that night, but I refused to let it consume me. I worked on my senses heightened, and my heart still racing from that same encounter. I started working out, I started locking doors, and I started taking the care and precaution that I should have been doing from day one. Even so, I developed some pretty significant PTSD, almost being shot in the head that night. This is one of the worst things that's ever happened in my place of work, and definitely the scariest thing to ever happen to me. It was night I truly felt like I was in danger, and anything could have happened. I consider myself lucky for walking away from this night shift experience. I no longer do nights, but for years, I did nights in residential care facilities. One of the spookiest was a sole charge dementia facility. 15 D3 residents and no one but me to keep an eye on all of them. They were elderly, wasn't for the most part. Especially if you knew how to interact like I did. Still, there's just something eerie in that. Yeah, spending 10 hours a day with blank, vacant, unpredictable people. I was never afraid of that, but there is a sense of being unsettled that naturally just comes to work. Around 3 a.m. in the morning, after doing an intentional round, that's where you check all the residents are safe. And well, I hear the doorbell ring. I got a sudden wave of goosebumps because this is a secure facility. It's in the middle of the night. I cannot express to you just how strange it is for someone to be at the front door at this hour. Honestly, it shouldn't even be possible. I started to think maybe it was a colleague that stopped by to drop something off for me, and that immediately put my nerves at ease. I go and look out the window and there's nobody there. I blow it off as being some kind of hallucination, because what else could it be? Someone ding-dong ditching an old folks' home. Not very likely not in this neighborhood. I roll it around in my head as I head back to the common room, resume my duties. I suppose I hear that bell enough. Perhaps it really was some kind of trick, all playing out my mind. I try not to give it any more thought. 10 minutes later, it rings again. I'm shitting myself at this point as it was a clear, crisp ring. Go to the window and check again. Nobody was there. But I look across the street. There's a strange car parked there. Now I take a photo of it just in case. Then go back to my station where I've been playing a game of match the card suits with a delightful but very demented lady. I sit down and she looks at me and says, "What did the gentleman want, dearie?" He looked like he had a bad and needs a cup of coffee. Chills immediately go down my spine. I brush it off because hallucinations are common with dementia, and this lady is particularly prone to not being oriented to a time and place. We keep playing our little game. She keeps casting a long glance over my shoulder down the hallway. Definitely some of the creepiest visuals of my life. I wanted to turn around so bad, but just the front door. I knew there would be nothing there. At this point, I was almost hoping there was. The doorbell rings again less than 5 minutes later, this time freaking the fuck out. Another one of my residents is up and walking the hallway, painting with a clear paintbrush to keep him occupied. I pass him on the way to the front window, and he turns to me and says, "Don't answer the door alone. He might hurt you before carrying on pain." My blood coagulates right there in my veins. "What did you say?" I prompt him. "Don't go to the door. Why is the man is liable to hurt you?" He explains to me there is day. "Do you know who that is?" I ask. He shakes his head and goes back to try paint. Shitting myself trying not to cry. I know what to do. I'm a single 23-year-old female in charge of 15 people with varying stages of dementia. And the fucking doorbell keeps ringing in the middle of the night. And it's a weekend, so my on-call won't even answer the phone. She never does on the weekends. This is not up to the industry standards by any means. But what options do I have? File a complaint while I'm getting murdered. I creep down the hall, try to be subtle and as quiet as possible. There are windows all over, so I'm trying not to give myself away as I get closer and closer to the front door. Look out the window and see that same car as before. And as I'm looking around, I see a shadow moving the front of the door, and a person walks over to the corner and then looks straight in the fucking window. Right next to me, we make eye contact. I scream. My residents start freaking out, and the guy just fucking bolts. I called the police and eventually they turn up. It's chaos because I have 15 residents who have all been woken up by the commotion. I have the police officers in their space. My on-call isn't answering your phone. I'm struggling to deal with this entire situation. Why was this man ringing the doorbell or shit? Why was he skulking around the side of the building? It was some kind of weird setup, and I just couldn't figure out why. Who would want to target some old person with dementia? Eventually, after many cups of tea into lots of PR, and meds for those more challenging residents are mostly settled. It's now 7 a.m. and the handover shift arrives. A nurse and a caregiver. I'm beyond grateful to still be alive. Along in with the others. I tell them what happened. They told me there was a woman down the road whose house was broken into. She was attacked in her bed by a drug seeker, ransacked her house while looking for drugs. He came in through a window and jumped on top of her while she was sleeping, tied her up, and then flipped the place upside down. I have an internal meltdown because we have drugs in the cupboard in the bedroom. Good drugs to morphine, methadone, fentanyl, etc. I can't help but wonder if he was intentionally looking for us. I just took the next best option. For desperate drug addict, my place of work is a godsend. 15 people who don't know who they are, and one little girl keeping them all together. If he'd gotten it, it would have been a dream come true. They got it played out the way it did, and he never made it past the front gate. For reference, the facility was an old converted boarding house in a gentrified area, so lots of old doctors' houses in the area. Easy to mistake the home that I worked for a regular house, but still part of me thinks he knew what he was doing. We were like the drug vault on the block, but he got cold feet when he saw someone in a uniform. I ended up leaving that job not long after the incident because they refused to hire a second person to work the nights, despite it being severely understaffed according to the best practice guidelines. Never again will I allow that to happen to me.